Good afternoon. This is Margie Kirby. Katasha and I will be discussing the differences between the state and federal processes. Some of this will be a recap. Some of this will be a more detailed review of how OEM coordinates with you on specific federal projects. Next, please, Ruth. So I will start with a quick recap of OEM's role as it relates to NEPA assignment for federal projects. And as a new PM or as a project manager of a new PD&E study, one of the first things you will want to do is establish whether or not it's a NEPA project. And remember, Jason touched on that federal nexus issue. Are there federal funds? Is there an interstate involved? Or in some cases, rare cases actually, are there federal lands involved? These are the kinds of things that would kick a project into NEPA. And again, in our role specific to those projects, we approve class of action determinations, purpose and need. We transmit certain technical reports to federal agencies, approve the NEPA documents and reevaluations, direct consultation with other federal resources agencies, hopefully very rarely defend NEPA document in court, and make the decisions and findings on federal laws and executive orders on behalf of FHWA, what they would have done under normal circumstances. Next. There are some other specific requirements in the NEPA MOU, which I'd like to highlight for your awareness. This first statement, which essentially discloses that FDOT is assuming the responsibilities of USDOT for environmental review, needs to appear on the cover of all technical documents and NEPA documents. This is generally done in SWEPT and is an easy mark to hit because we have so much internal review of these documents. The second bullet there, however, is really easy to miss. It's easy to accomplish and even easier to miss in that correspondence relating to public outreach, public involvement procedures, notices of scoping meetings, notice of intent, notice of public hearings or alternative workshops, all need to also have that statement appear on them. And like I said, that's not always a well-known hit point. And we've actually sadly had to have a couple of districts republish things or resend emails just a couple of times to make sure they got that statement front and center. Next. A couple of other specific requirements of the MOU, just for point of emphasis. Again, the environmental review is solely FDOT's responsibility. Important to note that FHWA does retain certain engineering review functions, though. So you may very well find yourselves coordinating with your FHWA area engineer on interstate design or interchanges, but also be aware that they are cognizant and very respectful of the fact that they do not have a role in the environmental review. So it's a little bit of splitting hairs, but it has been working and working pretty well. Section 4F determinations, of course, are made by FDOT unless they involve constructive use. I think we talked about this a little earlier, but constructive use is essentially an indirect impact to a 4F resource. That would be a park, recreation area, wildlife refuge that substantially impairs the function and use of that resource. And this is a nationally litigious issue. So if constructive use did become an issue, FHWA would engage with us on that. Tribal coordination, as mentioned by both Matt and Jason earlier, is conducted by FDOT unless it involves government to government consultation, a very specific thing. And then again, FHWA takes the lead on that. Air quality conformity determinations were retained by FHWA, but we're very fortunate, and that is not applicable in Florida since we are in attainment for air quality. Yay. Next. Again, as Jason mentioned yesterday morning, feels so long ago now, doesn't it? That NEPA is what is often called an umbrella law, and that complying with NEPA means you are also complying with other federal environmental laws and their implementing regulations. So when you are doing a federal project, a NEPA document, you naturally will have more requirements to meet, and try to consolidate those for you here. Be aware that alternatives analysis, considerations, and documentation for environmental assessments and environmental impact statements is more robust than it is for a state document. Section 4F determinations, again, only apply to the federal projects. EPA sole source aquifer determinations of the Clean Water Act only apply to the federal projects. Air quality we talked about for the conformity determination. Planning consistency requirements are more stringent when it comes to the approval of the NEPA document. I know Turnpike and Sears also have to show consistency with local plans, but there is a bit of a higher threshold to hit for the actual approval of the NEPA document. And we can always help you out with these things as needed. Farmlands, wild and scenic rivers, the Uniform Relocation Act provisions. For example, if you have a project that is going to displace residences, there are certain communication and notification practices with the displacees and replacement housing provisions that need to be met under the Uniform Relocation Act. And coastal barrier resources as a technical item to consider with federal documents. Next. Now that being said, Florida, of course, has also has to comply with many of these federal laws or has state statutes that are very similar to the federal laws. So you'll see similar requirements for NEPA and SEER documents, occasionally with some slight differences on basically these items as examples. Endangered Species Act coordination, listed species for the state under FWC, U.S. Coast Guard coordination when you have involvement with a navigable waterway, and do see the new navigation chapter in the PD&E manual for the nuances related to that if you should find yourselves with a Coast Guard permitting project. Cultural resources, as Matt described in some detail, Section 106 versus Florida Statute 267. Noise, as Maria pointed out, is the same for state as well as federal projects. Public involvement, Rusty just briefed us on. Florida has some pretty comprehensive public hearing requirements, so we hit those thresholds when we do public involvement for a federal project. ARC is also a new chapter in the PD&E manual. That's the Acquisition Restoration Council Coordination. And those cover state lands that are purchased for conservation with certain types of state funds. Now, this is a Florida requirement. However, it's incorporated in our process for NEPA documents as well. Because ARC coordination can take a considerable amount of time. It may require an MOU, it could require mitigation, and those kinds of things need some pre-planning on the department's part, and that just helps avoid potential delays or budgetary issues during design. So it's better to identify these properties up front and at least start that conversation with those land management agencies during PD&E. Federal and state permit requirements are essentially the same. Coastal zone consistency is obtained in both. However, with NEPA projects, we obtain that during the advance notification and generally during permitting for SEERs. Section 6F is another category of impact to park recreational lands, and if they are purchased with land and water conservation funds, then there is a coordination procedure in place. May involve DEP, may involve parkland replacement, that sort of thing. So it's just another issue that does span both NEPA and SEERs. I guess I will say, you know, all of these things, yes, each one of these things deserves attention on your projects. Obviously, there are more on federal projects, adds to time, planning, and coordination. Not every project has all of these things. So every project has its own story. The magic words, the C word, I call it coordination, is key in talking with the agencies or stakeholders who have interest in jurisdiction over each of these issues, listening well, and working through the issues is really the art form that's involved with PD&E. Again, no two projects are the same, and we do achieve them, however. So, and of course, OEM is always here to help with any of these more global processes or specific to subject matter areas and help you get through those processes should you need some assistance. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Katasha, who's going to speak a little bit more about OEM's engagement with federal projects. Thank you.
Thanks, Margie. Good afternoon, everyone. Katasha Cornwell. Like Margie said, we'll be talking a little bit about where we come into play on the federal process. And I know you guys have Matt as your project delivery coordinator and Mike as your engineer. And so this is going to be kind of discussing some of their roles throughout the process, as well as some of the opportunities where Margie and myself would come into this process as well, and Maria too. So starting off with the pre-screening during ETDM, I know Ruth and Pete have talked through this with you guys, and I know you do this already with some of your SEERs, but on the NEPA side, you'll have a pre-screening where your PDC and your lead engineer will be reviewing your purpose and need and your preliminary environmental discussion, your PED, and making sure there's a process to go through comments and comment resolution within the ETDM, within the EST itself. And so that happens before you move on to publishing your planning screen for the ETAT members to review. Once the planning screen has started and the ETAT's reviewing, the PDCs also have a role there where they would, towards the end, we kind of encourage them to wait till the end of that screening event to go into the tool and mark that purpose and need is understood. We're just trying to make sure that we've had a chance to review the ETAT comments that at least have come into that point. There obviously could be one or two lagging behind, but we try to ask them to take a look at those comments before marking that understood. If you happen to have a project that goes through ACE, that alternative corridor evaluation process, the PDC and lead engineer also get involved with looking at that methodology memorandum prior to the ETAT. And then, you know, others within the office as well might be looking at that. I like to stay engaged with that process, as well as Margie and Maria at times. And then making sure that, you know, that's a robust methodology before it goes out to the ETAT for their review. And then again, once that draft ACER, the ACE report is available, we will review that before it's out for the ETAT review. And then finally, throughout that ACE process, there's an actual part of the EST, the screening tool, that officially lets the PDC go in on behalf of OEM and approve elimination of alternatives. And again, that's done in coordination. So a lot of this stuff I'm going to be talking about where the PDC, it's their responsibility to kind of move forward on some of these actions. There's a lot of coordination internally still happening before they're taking that action. Similarly, as you move into programming screen events, the PDC will have another opportunity to review that purpose and need and make sure that they go in and mark it on behalf of OEM as approved or understood. Next slide, please, Ruth. So again, talking about it from the federal side, from the NEPA side, we'll have to make a class of action determination along the way. And this doesn't necessarily have to be done right after your screening event. You may have, I wasn't able to attend yesterday, so I'm not sure how much you might have heard about some of the new CEQ rules that have come out. Maybe not a lot, but some of this new rule that's going to go into effect will play into some of the ways we're looking at the timing of the class of action determination. But SWEPT itself has a tool to allow the district or the turnpike to provide a brief overview of the impacts and whether they're significant or not on the project, so that we can look that over, coordinate with you guys, and make sure we're making an appropriate class of action determination. So that form within SWEPT looks similar to what you might see in one of our type 2 categorical exclusions. If you're familiar with that, kind of outlines the list of issues and resources that are under social, cultural, natural, and physical areas, and kind of gives you the opportunity to say whether or not there's no involvement whatsoever, whether there's significant impacts or not, or whether there may be a question of significance. So that helps us kind of balance out what those potential impacts will be and what that class of action determination is. And again, similar to what I talked about before with regard to ACE or other parts of this process, the PDC has that opportunity to actually, on behalf of OEM, approve that class of action, but there's a lot of discussion. So even on type 2s, the PDCs and lead engineers are talking about that collectively. They're talking about it with the admins. And then if we need to, usually at that EA level or higher, we're talking to Jason to ensure that we're making the correct class of action determination. And so again, there can be some pre-work done on that. We don't necessarily have to jump right into that class of action determination. It can happen, shortly after the screening event if we all are confident, or if we need to spend a little more time doing a little bit more technical review or research, we can do that as well. So next slide, please. I think Margie mentioned some of the standard statements that we have, and then you'll hear me talk about that as well with regard to these report cover pages. So there's going to be once we move into the PD&E itself, so we've moved past ETDM, now we're into the PD&E process itself. There's going to be opportunity for OEM to engage during technical reviews. And a lot of these technical documents that we're going to talk about require the report cover pages that have our NEPA assignment verbiage on there. And they're available online. So if you guys ever need that, we can certainly point you in the right direction. But just that helps kind of hit that mark that Margie was talking about some. And then what are these documents? Where are we engaging? So on the engineering side, we're really looking at the traffic. So the PTAR, we call it, looking at that and making comments early on. If you, again, happen to have an interchange where you have to coordinate with FHWA and you need your MLOU, your methodology, letter of understanding, we're typically reviewing those. We don't approve them, but we do sometimes have comments similar to the interchange access request. But we do review the PER. So the PER comes in, we like to see that well before the public hearing. Typically and we're going to talk about the environmental document review process here in a minute, but typically we like to see that PER before we're looking at the draft environmental document to go to public hearing. But sometimes that's not happening, but you'll see if you have a chance, we're going to be, we have schedule templates that are out there, and you'll see where we're asking for folks to make sure that we're engaged in that review so that it doesn't hold you up. And then lastly, just if you, again, need SO&E acceptability on your IAR, then that has to also be done before your NEPA approval can be completed by Jason. Next slide, please. Again, just a reminder about the cover pages. So this applies also to the other technical documents that OEM reviews. And so those would be things like our Cultural Resource Assessment Survey, the CRAS. And we only review these when it comes to be an adverse effect on a historic resource. We're not looking at CRASs that don't have that. So we don't very often get involved in this review process. But part of the reason that we do is because as a result of that adverse effect, there's usually an MOU with SHPO, and sometimes that MOU can involve other agencies as well. But that's a legal document. Obviously, we review it closely. We review it with OGC here before it goes out to SHPO review, and continue on with that sort of comment resolution process as we're doing that initial review until it's ready for Jason's signature. And then, of course, the district and or the turnpike would also be a signatory to that MOU as well. So a lot of back and forth on those usually. We do have an MOU template for folks to use if you do run into a federal project and you have an adverse effect. And then travel coordination, as has been mentioned a number of times, is typically initiated through OEM, and I'm sure Matt described this in more detail yesterday. I unfortunately, like I said, wasn't able to attend that, so hopefully I'm not repeating something too much, but it basically is initiated through OEM, and then as time goes on, depending on the level of coordination, it sometimes can be then transferred to the turnpike to kind of coordinate on certain issues. When we look at natural resource evaluations, what we call the NRE, those also come to us for review, and all of those on federal projects come to us. It doesn't matter if it's a type 1, all the way up through an EIS, we're reviewing those. We have natural resource evaluation guidance that goes along with our chapter, which is part 2, chapter 16 in the manual. The guidance helps you understand whether or not you can get, you can do a technical memorandum versus the more fully developed technical report of an NRE. And so usually most projects require the full-blown NRE, and that's when you require consultation with the Fish and Wildlife Service or National Marine Fisheries, whether you trip a threshold with wetland impacts or whether you need some sort of EFH consultation. But when we're talking about consultation specifically, we're going to be reviewing your NRE before any of that consultation officially starts. And part of the reason for that is when we have formal consultation through National Marine Fisheries or U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service through the Endangered Species Act, OEM has to initiate that formal consultation. So we like to review those natural resource evaluations, make sure we are basically in agreement with the effect determinations that are being made for species. And if just in case, you know, maybe someone's making an effect determination that's a little bit less, maybe they're saying it's a MANLA versus a likely to adversely affect, you know, we have that opportunity to kind of correct that if we feel like we need to. And then again, if that formal consultation is required because of that, we can make sure we're initiating that properly. Next slide, please. Still within the realm of PD&E, Margie mentioned 4F being something that we do when we have NEPA documents. And this sort of review can be a little tricky at times. It does require some subject matter expert coordination. So we have Matt, who you know as your PDC, as well as your subject matter expert for 106 and 4F. And then we also have Roy Jackson in our office who can support these reviews as well. They've recently worked together with Pete and Ruth and their team on developing a module within the SWEP tool itself to help with some of these 4F reviews. And certainly can provide some more information about that if you guys run into these situations in the future. But really the trick is to determine whether or not a property might be applicable, whether 4F is applicable to that property or not. And if it is, then you would move on through some of these next forms or reviews within the SWEP tool. And so if you do have a property that you want to document, you may not have a use. You just may want to document that that property is adjacent to your project and that you want to just let everyone know you've looked to confirm that you don't have a use. And so that can be done through the SWEP tool. There's also exceptions and exemptions, and then again, temporary occupancy, these sort of reviews and approvals. Well, maybe not approvals is the right word, but documentation of these types of 4F resources when you're maybe temporarily impacting them that can be documented within the SWEP tool itself, and then Roy and Matt have the opportunity to kind of concur with how that's being documented. As we move up to some of the higher level official approvals, de minimis and programmatics and individuals, those again can start out through review in the tool, but then require a little bit more involvement and then final approval by Jason. The de minimis and the programmatic evaluations can be approved through the SWEP tool itself, but individual evaluations eventually will have to be all documented outside of the SWEP tool and in more of a formal presentation, almost like an environmental document or within your environmental document, depending on the level of your class of action. And those all individual evaluations require review by the Office of General Counsel, and not just review, but what we call legal sufficiency review. So an official confirmation within the SWEP tool as you go through the official approval process to get Jason's sign off. The legal sufficiency is the very last thing that has to happen before he can sign off on those documents. Next slide. So I thought it would be good just to talk briefly about the review process that OEM has. So we've made it all the way through the PD&E. You guys have done all of your technical documents. You are now drafting the environmental document itself. And this, what we call kind of like our game board, is a little bit, there's a lot of information on here, right? So I broke it down into some smaller chunks on the next few slides. And this represents the review process for a type 2 categorical exclusion. But if you have a higher level class of action, an EA or an EIS, the same process would be followed, but it would be followed basically in 2 steps where your EA would go through a review process to be signed off by Jason for public availability. And then once you've gone through that process for public review and comment, you come back with your FONSI, hopefully, right, to get that final review again. And so you would come through this same process on that document. For your draft EIS, again, you come through this full process, go through the public review and comment period. Your final EIS would then go through this review and approval process again. So next slide, please. So we kind of broke this down. Ruth, I know, was earlier talking about the different roles and responsibilities, and that's kind of what those little game pieces are there in the different color codings. And so, you know, your project editors and preparers can go into SWEP and start loading up your document, start, at least for the type 2 itself, there's a form in SWEP that you fill out similar to, not maybe exactly similar, but kind of with the same idea as a non-major state action. It's already built into the system. A higher level document isn't like that. You have to just draft those outside of the system. But your editors can go in and get the project set up. Your project managers and project development engineers will then go through a confirmation process, basically a process to say they've done their QC on their side and the document is now ready for OEM's review. And we call this the initial review that you're going to be submitting for. So next slide. So this initial review, maybe a little nuanced, but for a type 2 happens usually after the public hearing. And then again, for the EA or EIS, it's happening prior to public hearing. But this initial review happens in ERC for the most part. So we get the environmental document itself through ERC, and then we have what we call an environmental document submittal form that comes through SWEP to the PDC to alert them that, hey, this document, the project manager has confirmed, it's ready for review. So the PDC, the engineer, OGC if we need them, other subject matter experts, again, such as Roy or others that may need to review that initial environmental document, get together, and within the 30-day period, provide one set of comments back to the Turnpike, I guess in this case, on what their concerns are, what the clarifications are needed for the document. We move on kind of to the purple box there, where the district then takes some time to respond. So it's really up to the district or the Turnpike, depending on your project schedule, depending on the nature of the comments and how long it'll take to address them. We, generally think 2 weeks is a fair amount of turnaround time, but that's really up to you guys to get the document back to us in a timely fashion that, again, works for your schedule and is commensurate with the comments that you received. And then we finish up with the comment resolution process. Similar to plans reviews, we're just looking to document that the comments we've made have all been resolved appropriately. On occasion, there's a few things that still need to be tweaked, but for the most part, we expect back sort of a response, like a written response to the comments, as well as an updated version of the document to ensure that the comments were addressed as we expect them to be. So you can imagine sometimes people might say, will do, or will comply, things like that, but that's not super helpful when we're wanting to see exactly how our comment was implemented. So we usually expect a corrected document back as well. Next slide, please. So once that initial review is done, again, by the PDCs and the engineers for the most part, as well as any other subject matter experts that we need, the project manager then again will approve that document, say that all their QC has been done and it's ready to move on back to OEM for the final approval. So this stage then has a few steps where the project delivery coordinator gets the document back through SWEPT this time. Everything's through SWEPT, that environmental document submittal form and the actual environmental document itself are all coming through SWEPT this time for that official final review. That PDC has 14 days to confirm the project is really ready to move on to the next level, which would be what we call the admin or the EPA level, the environmental program administrators level, which would currently be myself and Margie. And so they don't typically take that whole 14 days. Most of the time, there's been enough coordination during that comment resolution period that the PDCs are very confident that they can move a document on within a day or two after it comes into their queue. On occasion, there may have been something outstanding. Maybe you're still finishing up some consultation and you're just making some final edits to your document that's already kind of been agreed upon up front. Maybe a significant amount of time has passed for whatever reason that we haven't seen the document. Maybe you're dealing with planning consistency or whatever, but on occasion, it'll take a little longer than that 14-day time frame. And on occasion, you're gonna see this little minor edits arrow there. There's an opportunity within the system specifically to be able to have the PDC say, hey, there's a couple tweaks I need you to make. Can you please fix these things, or these last final comments weren't really resolved like we thought they were. Please make these edits before I send it on to the EPA level for review. All that's done, they move it on, then it's in my queue and Margie's queue for, again, that admin review. We have 25 days, and I'll say we usually review the documents very quickly within the first 5 or 6 days, but the overall process tends to take close to the full 25 days because, again, we have that minor edit option as well. We typically will have a few final clarifications or adjustments that need to be made on the document. And again, so we go through this minor edit process. The district or the turnpike would have, maybe 5 or 6 or 8 or 10 days to kind of resolve those for us. And as that time goes on, then we're kind of getting close to that 25-day mark. And we take up those last few days of that 25-day period, again, to just kind of confirm that all of our comments have been addressed. And once we've got that confirmation, once we're really comfortable, then Margie and myself each kind of move that document on. We have a button in SWEPT that we hit that says that the document is ready for director's approval, and that goes to Jason. That's, with the little asterisk that you can see that little brown box off to the side where we have those legal sufficiency reviews. We have one of those individual 4Fs I was just mentioning, or if we have an EIS, we have to also go through legal sufficiency review on those final EISs as well. So there'll be a little extra step there that can take some extra time if legal hasn't been thoroughly involved the entire time. We typically try to keep them involved throughout the process. But so that's that final director approval, and you'll get emails along the way as this process happens through SWEPT to let you know where your document is. And then there's also, it's easy to kind of track the progress of your document as well within SWEPT itself if you're not seeing the emails. So Ruth, with that, I think that's my last slide. Oh, no, I lied. Lastly, there's other points along the way where OEM is engaged in the project development process where you obviously got your PD&E document approved, your NEPA document approved, and Christine mentioned reevaluations previously, and similar for Sears, there's reevaluations for NEPA documents. And we do review these, again, initial review and final review. So that same process I just talked about would happen for reevaluations as well. Just to clarify, a reevaluation is not required to start design. Reevaluations are usually only required when a phase change happens. So when you get what we call LDCA, your location design concept acceptance for a NEPA document, your design is authorized. You don't have to come back for a reevaluation. But if you want to move to right-of-way or construction, and it's been a year after your PD&E document has, or your NEPA document has been approved, then you do need to come back to OEM for that review. Or along the way, if you have design changes that require reevals or changes in law that need to be documented, those also require reevaluations. Margie mentioned previously about planning consistency being a little more scrutinized on federal documents. And so again, as you're moving from phase to phase, you have to show within your reevaluation that planning consistency still being there. A reevaluation may also need to document how Section 7 ESA consultation has been reinitiated and what the results of that are. That seems to happen on a fairly regular basis. And again, if you have an IAR reevaluation, you really need to be coordinating with your district interchange coordinator. Presumably, the Turnpike has one of these as well, just to make sure that you've got your IAR reevaluation wrapped up so that we can approve the NEPA reevaluation. We're waiting on that approval before we do the NEPA reevaluation